giving time for people to join. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Colin Ross, and I'm delighted to be your moderator for this virtual program this afternoon, Unlocking the Power of Open Science for Pharmacists and Scientists. I'm a professor and the Interim Associate Dean of Research in the UBC Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences, and I'm also a very proud UBC alum. I graduated in '93 with an undergraduate degree. So for today's event, we're using Zoom's live captioning to ensure that the event is more accessible and inclusive. So please look to the bottom of your Zoom window for the Show Captions button, where you have the option to turn it on or turn it off according to your preferences. And if at any point during the webinar you experience any audio or video issues, please reach out via the chat and a staff member will be in touch with you. I'm very privileged to work on UBC's Vancouver campus, and I respectfully acknowledge that it's situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and UBC's Okanagan campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Nation in the Okanagan. I would also like to recognize the many places near and far that you are all joining us from and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. And to learn more about the land on which you sit, I recommend the resource native-land.ca that's on the screen. It's a really amazing website and wonderful resource. So by acknowledging the traditional owners of these lands, we're reminding ourselves that Canada's legacy of colonization continues into the present, and that all of us have an obligation to advance reconciliation and decolonization in this country. Now, the UBC Respectful Environment Statement provides the guiding principles to support us in building a setting in which respect, civility, diversity, opportunity, and inclusion are all valued. And on behalf of the UBC Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences, I'd like to extend a warm welcome and a thank you in advance for helping create a respectful and inclusive environment for your fellow alumni, guests, and speakers. Now, the forward is the UBC campaign for UBC. It's the biggest fundraising and alumni engagement campaign in UBC's history. And with the support of alumni, donors, and friends like all of us joining today, UBC is advancing the healthy lives and a healthy planet and healthy societies while addressing the immediate affordability needs of UBC students. And today's topic is representative of one of the many ways that UBC is undertaking research to help create healthier lives. And the Innovative Thinkers webinar series is part of the faculty's alumni programming created to highlight our researchers, our faculty, and our alumni from the UBC Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences. The faculty's vision is to be a catalyst for change in pharmacy practice and in the pharmaceutical sciences. And our goal as innovators in pharmacy, education, and research and practice is to support the optimization of drug therapy in the pursuit of improved patient outcomes. And we're thrilled to have you with us today, for this is the second webinar in the Innovative Thinkers webinar series. And in just a few moments, I'm going to introduce Dr. Jacqueline Craig, who will begin with a short presentation. And then following that, I'll start off with some conversation by asking Jacqueline some questions, and then we'll address questions from all of you in our audience. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our fantastic speaker for today's conversation. So let's go ahead and have Dr. Craig join me on the screen as I introduce her. So Dr. Craig is an assistant professor here at the University of British Columbia in the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences. And she is a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Open Data Science. And she's also a principal investigator at the International Collaboration on Repair Discoveries, abbreviated as ICORD, and a Michael Smith Health Research BC Scholar, a very prestigious award. and a L'Oreal UNESCO for Women in Science International Rising Talent awardee. So welcome, Dr. Craig.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ross. I'm really delighted to be here for this really important conversation. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so to facilitate some of the question and answering, we're going to use Slido. It's an online audience engagement platform. And on it, you can enter your own questions. And so to do this, please go to slido.com. I'll spell that out. It's SLIDO.com. And you use our event code, which is Open Science, all lowercase, Open Science, no capitals and no spaces, just one word, Open Science, to sign in. And there you can submit your own questions, and you can upvote other questions that you'd like to see answered if maybe other people are asking the same questions. Okay, so open science is a realm characterized by the pursuit of discovery, collaborative efforts, unwavering transparency, and active engagement. And these principles of open science resonate deeply with the fundamental rights to health equity, and social justice. And they emphasize the imperative to share the most robust evidence as widely as possible for the collective benefit of all. So Jacqueline, I will turn it over to you for your presentation. Thanks.
Thanks again, Dr. Ross, and thanks everyone so much for joining us. So I'm really excited to share with you today my journey with open science and how it's relevant to pharmacists and scientists and pharmacist scientists as well. So the United Nations, UNESCO, recently released their recommendations on open science, and similarly, the Government of Canada, through the Office of the Chief Science Advisor of Canada, they released their roadmap for open science in 2020. And one of the recommendations from the roadmap was that Canada should adopt an open science approach to federally funded scientific research and outputs. So I think, the definition of open science, I think, varies across disciplines, and I think it will vary across time as new technologies develop and our values also change. But for now, I think it's important to have a working definition of open science, which is UNESCO's definition, which is that open science is the practice of making scientific inputs, outputs, and processes freely available to all with minimal restrictions. Open science is enabled by people, technology, and infrastructure. It is practiced in full respect of privacy, security, ethical considerations, and appropriate IP protection. So there's actually a lot in this kind of one definition. There's actually a lot to unpack. So I don't have time to unpack all these pieces. I think each one could be a webinar. So I will just share you a piece of open science that's been my research with open science. So in understanding open science, I think it's useful to have some practical examples of open science. So the United Nations created this diagram that relates kind of the four kind of pillars of open science, which includes open dialogue with other knowledge systems, including Indigenous knowledge systems, open engagement of societal actors, which really includes patient and public involvement in research, sort of perhaps kind of non-traditional participants across the entire research continuum, open science infrastructure, and open scientific knowledge, which includes, a lot of us are familiar with open access scientific publications. And then my real interest is in open research data and open data sharing. In our faculty, a lot of our pharmacists have produced, some of our amazing pharmacy educators have produced some really great open educational resources. And then other examples include open source software and source code, which is of course related to open research data, and then open hardware. So these again are the four pillars of open science with some examples so that it's not sort of an abstract concept. I think even if you're not kind of sort of deep into open science, you can, I think, quickly see some of the potential benefits of open science in terms of increased access to research inputs and outputs. I think another potential benefit is an increased trust in science, particularly from the general public. And we saw some important examples of the importance of trust in science through the pandemic. Another is increasing reproducibility through open data sharing and being able to reproduce results or research the results of research studies, which is replication. reducing burden on research participants through open data sharing, and then all in all, to really the overall idea is really to accelerate scientific progress. As you also probably picked up from the definition, is that there are some potential drawbacks to open science. Open science by nature is, of course, open. So there is, especially, of course, in the context of health research, privacy and confidentiality issues are really at the forefront of some of the potential barriers to open science. On the data side, there's also issues with data quality and how we can assess quality and how we can maintain quality of open resources. And then there's also the potential barrier that open science, a lot of people sort of against open science think that it can limit innovation. And then lastly, a lot of people perceive that there's a lack of support for open data science, particularly from the owners of the data, which is really research participants and the general public as well, through their daily interactions with the healthcare system. So I really as I say, my focus is more on the open research data side. So I wanted to just share a couple of examples of what I view as a success story in open science. So my research is mainly in the realm of neurological diseases, in particularly in traumatic spinal cord injury. So traumatic spinal cord injury results in motor deficits, including paralysis. But what a lot of people don't realize too is that spinal cord injury actually affects all body systems, in particular the cardiovascular and respiratory systems. It also affects, besides of course the nervous system, it also affects the GI system and the immune system. Really, every body system is affected in the very early stages after a traumatic spinal cord injury. So what a lot of people also don't realize about traumatic spinal cord injury is that there is actually natural, or what we call endogenous, neurological recovery after spinal cord injury. So this is a graph within the first year following injury. So these individuals were tracked very early, right after injury, over the first year. And on the y-axis, we have lower extremity motor score, which is a measure of muscle strength, of course, in the lower extremities. And what we have found is that the neurological recovery after spinal cord injury, as you can see, each line represents an individual subject, and the darker lines represent these clusters, which we've used open source software to come up with clusters that group these trajectories into three different groups. So we see some individuals have zero recovery, and then some have this kind of rapid increase, which then plateaus within the first year following injury. So again, there's this kind of initial increase and then this plateau, which results in this permanent disability. Putting neurological recovery aside, as I mentioned, a lot with all the body systems affected by spinal cord injury, it may or may not be surprising that in the early stages of spinal cord injury, there are a lot of medications administered right from the initial injury and to the first. We track medication use in this case over the first 60 days following injury. So in this figure, each panel represents a unique individual. So in this case, for example, was a male where the spinal cord injury was caused by a gunshot wound on the far left, over to a motor vehicle accident on the far right, in 4 different individuals. And the individual medications aren't so important here, but just to show that there are a lot of medications administered early after injury. So each line, oh, sorry, it's jumping on me. Each line represents a unique medication. And the blue dots indicates when, relative to the injury, when that medication was given. So from this, we can tell, of course, there are a lot of medications that are administered early after injury, and 2, a lot of these medications are administered in an overlapping or what we call concomitant fashion after injury. And Dr. Yutzler, who's now this was some of her postdoc work, but she's now an assistant professor at the ETH in Zurich. She actually she was the first to quantify the number of medications after injury, which within 60 days after injury is on average 20 unique medications administered to an individual. But the upward end of this is over 60 unique medications within the first 60 days after injury. So So we were kind of thinking about, we've been mapping neurological recovery after spinal cord injury, and then we'd also been looking at all of these medications that are administered in really acute stages. So we thought, we were really thinking about whether these processes were actually linked. Is neurological recovery potentially related to some of this concomitant medication use? And again, these medications are, of course, there are no approved medications in traumatic spinal cord injury. There are no approved pharmacological interventions. So these medications are all given for these secondary complications or sequelae of spinal cord injury versus treating the injury itself. But we sought to see is all this variability, we saw that really messy graph of this unexplained variability that's not all explained by initial injury severity. Could some of this unexplained variability be explained by all of these medications, either alone or in combination? And again, we felt we had a strong rationale for this, is that because these medications are administered early after injury, many of the medications are centrally acting, either initially centrally acting or as a result of the blood-brain barrier changes. And then also with a lot of these medications, sorry, it's jumping again on me. With a lot of these medications, there are patient, caregiver, and healthcare providers' concerns that some of these medications might interfere with neurological recovery. And in some cases, some of the medications might actually be beneficial with respect to neurological recovery or the recovery of muscle strength. So for the last kind of 10 years, we've been asking the question, do some of these commonly used medications, these concomitant medications, affect neurological recovery, or that is the recovery muscle strength after spinal cord injury? But when we start to ask some of these questions, we thought, okay, how do we design the study to do this? Where do we find these data? Where do we find the data that has neurological outcomes of clinical measures and also medication use? Okay, so we could conduct a chart review, for example. That would probably be feasible. It has the data we want, but it's fairly time consuming, especially given it would definitely need to be a multi-center piece. Can we use some administrative data or health insurance claims, like in using POP data linked with PharmaNet, which tracks, as we know, tracks medication use in BC or other similar databases? Or could we find data using an open data source through open data sharing? So we started to think about trials that tracked concomitant medication uses and neurological outcomes. So we approached Dr. Fred Geisler, who's a neurosurgeon, now retired, and he was the principal investigator on a major clinical trial in the field of spinal cord injury. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1991. And they did an early phase, and then the second stage clinical trial was published later in Spine in the early 2000s. And they were looking at the recovery of motor function with a trial medication. And although they didn't find any, they didn't find any treatment success, this resulted in a really kind of rich database that of course others could potentially use. So as I say, we approached Dr. Geisler and said, do you still have these data? And if so, would it be possible to access these data? And he said, yes, absolutely. But when he handed over the data, these data had been sort of dormant for 20 years. So a lot of the files were outdated file types. So we actually spent we tried to estimate about probably 1,000 hours to get the data into something that we and other groups could analyze. And medication data, I worked with medication data from all different types, from clinical trials and PharmaNet. And it can be really, really kind of messy to work with, especially when it's multi-center and especially when it's multinational as well, because everyone has different ways of entering in medication. So we consulted a lot with pharmacists and other healthcare providers to get that data into an analysis-ready format. So although that was kind of time-consuming, it's not a glamorous piece, but now we have access to the largest and most comprehensive acute trial to date. There has not been another trial since this time that of this magnitude and that included so many injury severities. So we have, and the SIGEN trial included more than 700 individuals with spinal cord injury. And because it was an FDA regulated trial, the data collection was so comprehensive. it became such a rich data source. The only cost was, of course, the time to kind of clean and merge these sources and get them analysis ready. But of course, that would pale into comparison to what we would have to the cost of actually collecting that prospectively or even retrospectively with other data sources. And we've actually, since we were able to kind of sit through this kind of with this open data sharing, we've been able to clean the data, use the data, and then also share the data with others. So this is just one example on the left of, we were looking at whether or not, so some clinicians came to us and said they were concerned that baclofen, so which is, as many of you may know, certainly better with pharmacy backgrounds, the audience, that baclofen is given for spasticity, and it's administered very early after injury in traumatic spinal cord injury. And clinicians and a lot of patients and their caregivers expressed concern that baclofen was actually interfering with their recovery of muscle strength. So that plot I showed earlier that was kind of all over the place, a lot of people were concerned that baclofen might interfere. So using this rich data source, we were able to demonstrate on the left here that baclofen was not actually associated with any, certainly not associated with worse recovery, and in some injury levels it was associated even with more beneficial recovery. And then since then other groups, and which we've collaborated with to use the data, have produced, this is one example in the middle here. Dr. Yutzler created this really awesome shiny app using open source software, and now these days anyone in the entire world, free of charge, can access they don't have access to the raw data, but they have access to all of the summary measures for the vast majority of the variables, and they can do different subsets, and they can so they can use this for, people have told me they've been using this for power and sample size calculations, for writing grants. They also use this as sort of historical control data, and then also for hypothesis generating exercises for other research studies. And then other groups too on the far right here. This is just one of many examples where this open data sharing this was another study looking at clustering in complete traumatic spinal cord injury. So that's more severe traumatic spinal cord injuries, to look at cluster analyses of progression. So there was obviously a major benefit to the entire field, certainly our group, but also lots of other groups in terms of this open data sharing. So in addition to using open data, I've also been really involved in also studying, in researching open data practices themselves. And to me, the study that I'm just about to talk about, I think it links this UNESCO's comment about open scientific knowledge and linking these open engagement of societal actors, which includes, according to UNESCO's definition, the general public and individuals who actually participate in research. So a few years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine, there was what's considered in the field a landmark study that looked at clinical trial participant views on the risks and benefits of data sharing. So they actually asked people who had participated in trial, they asked them whether or not do they agree with open data sharing. And I've highlighted one of the major findings here was that of the individuals they surveyed, a total of 93% were very or somewhat likely to allow their own data to be shared. And this is health data, right? Their own health data to be shared with university scientists. And a high number, a slightly lower, but still high number, were very or somewhat likely to share their health data with scientists in for-profit companies. What I think a lot of people didn't realize about this study in the New England Journal of Medicine is that it included mainly healthy controls who had participated in research. So we were wondering, wait, what about individuals with complex conditions? Would potentially their views on open data sharing differ because they have complex medical conditions? So we asked them. We recently published a study called The Perspectives on Data Sharing in Persons with Spinal Cord Injury. And similar to the New England Journal of Medicine finding, we found that individuals with spinal cord injury generally support open data sharing. So in this case, the majority of participants believe that the potential benefits of data sharing outweighed some of the negatives, like potential privacy and confidentiality issues. We also tried to take the New England Journal of Medicine study one step further, and not just say, okay, do you agree or disagree with open data sharing, but also are there specific types of data that you would be more or less likely to share? So here what we have is on the x-axis, we have different types of health data. So for example, would you be willing to share data on on your potential sexual dysfunction or metabolic disease or emotional health or respiratory problems and so on? A range of these secondary complications associated with spinal cord injury. We asked for each of these data types. Would you be willing to, what was your sort of level of comfort regarding sharing these specific types of data? So the blue indicates very or somewhat comfortable. So you can see for most data types, generally over 50% of individuals were very or somewhat comfortable in sharing even all of these array of data types, even ones that we often associate with being potentially kind of more kind of private or stigmatizing. But as we can also see, though, that there is some variability in terms of specific types of data that people are willing to share. So I think that's kind of an important piece in developing kind of an evidence base for open data sharing practices, is that it might be kind of case specific. It might, depend on the actual type of data that are being collected in the study. So this, I think, I consider kind of a success story of open science. We certainly live some of these proposed benefits of open science in terms of reducing burden on research participants through, instead of collecting new data, we were able to, through open data sharing, we're able to complete a study with much more limited costs and hopefully also accelerate scientific progress within the field of traumatic spinal cord injury. And this work, I think, also shows, of course, there are some of these barriers and major issues we need to be concerned with open science. But in general, I kind of put a question mark along is there actually a lack of support for open data science, especially among the owners of the data? But I think we still have a long ways to go for open science. I think there's still a lot of steps that we need to be kind of successful in open science initiatives, including specific funding initiatives for open data. A lot of open data, especially on the data management side, it's not glamorous, as I mentioned. It's a lot of data cleaning. It's maintaining and supporting and checking quality. But we still need some funding for that. It's much cheaper than running prospective trials, but we need funding for open data. We also, I think, need to survey more in terms of views on open data sharing from not just certainly individuals and patients, but also from healthcare providers like pharmacists and other healthcare providers. I think there's also a need to have input from, especially on the medication side, to have input from pharmacists and other medication experts in terms of the data collection side, because that is the strength, the quality of the data collection really, I think, facilitates the ability to share and reanalyze data. And then lastly, we also, I think, really need metrics to measure the success of open data science. How do we, for example, measure that open science actually, actually does accelerate scientific progress, or does it actually increase trust in science? We still need, I think, to develop metrics for these, to develop really an evidence base for open science practices. Just as you have evidence-based practice, we need an evidence-based sort of practice of open science as well. So thank you, and I'm really happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for that fantastic presentation. And I just want to give a quick reminder to our audience to please don't forget to add your own questions to Slido and use our event code OpenScience to sign in. And I'm going to begin with some questions for you, Jacqueline. So once again, just thank you for your outstanding presentation. It's such an important topic. And I just wanted to maybe give you another opportunity to talk about, I know you talked a little bit about what you work on, but I wondered if you wanted to give a bigger perspective of what you personally are researching here at UBC. And hoping you can include some of the, maybe some of the inspiration and motivation of what drives you for the work that you do, and what really inspires you to do this research?
Sure. Yeah. So I think kind of what inspired me was I'm also like Dr. Ross, I'm a UBC alum as well, and during my PhD, I really started to use a lot of open data sets and sort of became more aware of some of the strength and also some of the limitations of open data. And then in 2019, I was really fortunate to have the opportunity to attend at the United Nations headquarters right in Paris. It's a really kind of awe-inspiring building. And I attended a debate on open science, and that kind of really kind of opened my mind to how many different fields, not just in health, but in climate change and other fields that are really kind of advocating for the importance of open science. So that was kind of the initial kind of inspiration, I think, for being for not only using open data, but also now kind of researching open data. And I'm really continuing the data set that I talked about. We're still, we are still using that, and we are still there's so many medications to explore in the context of traumatic spinal cord injury. But what's really cool now is through an awareness of some of these databases is we've had lots of new collaborations with basic scientists as well, who can provide kind of biological mechanistic rationale for some of the medications we look at with open clinical data.
Okay, great. So another question I had was a little bit more specific, but just what role does collaboration play in open science?
Yeah, I think open science and collaboration are almost kind of synonymous. I think open science sort of denotes collaboration, and UNESCO, the figure I showed where all that those sort of four interlocking puzzle pieces, those are all I think have collaborative elements. I think we saw a lot of collaboration during the pandemic, and a lot of people have attributed some of the successes from in speedy vaccine development and mathematical modeling to open science pieces. So collaboration and a lot of the open sources that I work with are multi-center, which collaboration is such a vital piece of. So I think, yeah, I really think collaboration and open science go really hand in hand.
Good. Okay. One of the questions that came to my mind, and you actually answered it in your talk, was, what makes some people more willing to share, really personal data like health data? And you answered this in your talk, and you talked about some of the variability depending on the different conditions that the patient might have. I was wondering what really truly deeply makes some participants more willing to share their data than other people. And one of the questions on Slido is related to this, and I just wanted to ask this question. So could you please comment on the ethics review on data sharing and the potential challenges to recruit study participants who do not want to share their data?
Yeah.
I can, okay.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Colin. Go ahead.
No, I was going to reread it for you, because you probably can't see it in front of you, but it was about ethics review of data sharing and the potential challenges of recruiting study participants who may not want to share their data.
Okay, yeah. So I think just first to say I'll sort of answer that maybe hopefully in a couple of pieces, one is to say that the empirical evidence suggests that, at least from early stages of research, that individuals are actually more willing to share, I think, than people think. I think that's why that article was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, is that people actually are, and I didn't talk about it, but it actually, a lot of it related to altruism. They thought it would really benefit other people. And they also asked in that study, we also asked to whether or not people wanted to be compensated for if we were sharing their data with other companies. And in general, they didn't even require that as a condition. But they did require, and I think this relates to the question, is that they would be, they didn't require consent, but they did say that they would recommend asking for consent. But a lot of people, the majority of people, still said that even if consent wasn't required, that they would still approve of the use of at least anonymized data. So to answer the question in the chat then, is that So I think there are certainly potential challenges, but I think now there's lots of nice language to include that consent in protocols and in consent forms. And I've seen this in a lot of studies. In the study that we did with the spinal cord injury, it was asking on open data sharing, but of course we eventually want to make that an open data source as well. So we included in the consent form that to ask whether or not individuals would consent to having their de-identified data publicly available. So I think though it's also the New England Journal of Medicine also, they did study general predictors of open data sharing, but I think though now we are probably at the stage where it's time to actually look at interventions to probably increase, especially among those who are not willing to actually look at interventions for to kind of increase participation in open data sharing. And I think part of that would really just be to really educate people on the importance, on the cost savings to research, which is really a national issue. So I hope that answers the question on
that's great.
Challenges to recruit participants.
Okay, now I have another question. I've got a few questions on Slido, but I'm just going to ask this one first. How do you see pharmacists and maybe other researchers at UBC benefiting from open science, and are there limits to where it can be applied?
So I think for pharmacists, I think so many great examples of other scientists, some really great and other healthcare providers as well. Really great examples. The top that come to mind are in open educational resources, and we have some great in-house examples in our faculty because we have such an awesome group of pharmacy educators. Of course, a lot of people think of open access publications. And that is, I think most people, agree with most of those kind of principles. And that's particularly important for pharmacists and other individuals in resource limited countries, right? Who don't have, university subscriptions to libraries. And then also, I think also for pharmacists, I think I just looked at a study that revealed a completely open access drug interactions database. I think it's called DD Inter, and it's I think a really great. I think still kind of new, but there's Drug Bank and a lot of these open access resources for that I think are also useful tools to. I'm not a pharmacist myself, but that are useful to pharmacists, and I think those would probably be the main ones, and I think there'll be more to come in the future.
Okay, I'm going to just combine two questions here. So you showed some great examples of success stories of open science in the field of spinal cord injury. Was the Shiny app related to the spinal cord injury? I think that was, or wasn't it?
Oh yes, yes, it's related to traumatic spinal cord injury. Yeah, and
were you able to share that? I can, maybe in the chat or. Okay.
Yes, I can definitely share that. And I could. I'm not sure if I can, because the chat, I'm not sure if it goes to the participant. I could share it with the I could perhaps share it with Shina, and then and then we can send it to everyone if that works.
Yeah, and that's a great example. Are there other really big success stories that come to your mind in open science that you didn't get a chance to mention?
Sure. Yeah. So I focus mostly on neurological diseases. So I think there's, probably like hundreds of other examples, but within neurological diseases, so I mentioned ours in spinal cord injury, there's also a really great example in the field of ALS, so Lou Gehrig's disease, and also in Parkinson's. So both of those fields produced, in Parkinson's, they produce this amazing open access resource. It's called PPM. It's called the PPMI. And you can right now, within a couple of hours, as long as you have an email address, they will, within, I think, a few hours, release it probably would have been like a $20 million worth of data collection on. It includes brain imaging, it includes CSF sampling, it includes a battery of clinical measurements over time in hundreds of individuals with Parkinson's disease. And that study was completed a few years ago, but it's still being used in tons and tons of studies on Parkinson's progression and secondary complications of Parkinson's. It's been a really, really rich resource and a really, really shining example of basically a registry that's completely open to researchers or the general public. And ALS has done something similar with another open database called PROACT. And what they did was they didn't prospectively collect the data. They used similar to what we did, but with lots of different little trials that they merged together. Because of course ALS is a really rare condition, so having merged databases, they de-identified the data and they pooled a few observational studies and, as I say, a bunch of clinical trials. And that database is also, again, you can search it right now and download a really rich data set in the field of ALS. So that's also been some really great success stories. Others in ADNI and dementia. There's so many awesome examples.
Okay, good, thanks. What are some of the obstacles that need to be overcome to continue to make progress in open science? And what do you think that we need to be able to get to where we want to go in the future?
Yeah, I think probably more. So now that we're using open science so much, I think more research on best practices, like on what type of data should be shared, how to share it. Relate to the question from the chat about how we can improve awareness or kind of uptake of open science. I think now that's one piece. And then the second piece related to that is really funding for open science initiatives. A lot of the open science, some of it is really not on the data side. It's not glamorous. I mean, this applies to a lot of other pieces, but I think, so funding for, say I need some money I need a grant, I need to write a grant to basically clean and maintain and check, do quality checks. That's not really glamorous, but I think we do need to support funding for open science. And then I think breaking down some of the common misconceptions about open science as well is really important.
Oh, good, thanks. I've used an open source data set called the UK Biobank, it's incredible. I've used it for research and I've used it also for teaching, and it's just an amazing opportunity for teaching. When you mentioned the value of a Parkinson's data bank, it's like being given a gift of $20 million. And I felt exactly the same with UK Biobank. I felt like it's like someone is just giving you the keys to a data set that's worth, in this case, probably 100 million or hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's such a powerful tool for teaching too.
Totally agree on both fronts, and a lot of my colleagues use the UK Biobank and totally agree. And for teaching as well is great for, especially like I do a lot of biostatistics teaching. It's great for examples for that. Yeah.
I have a specific question from Slido about that I think it's relevant to our faculty, and it's how could pharmacists participate in open science and contribute in this space?
Yeah, so I mean, personally, I'll talk about maybe personally and then kind of from the wider perspective too. So first of all, I think it's incredibly important that they do, especially for specific types of data. As I mentioned, drug data I find is some of the messiest data I've ever worked with, especially because, as I say before, some of the variations in data quality and standards. And I really brushed up on my Latin the last time we were cleaning some medication files, learning all the pharmacist abbreviations and so on. So I think if you're interested, if you have an interest in it, a couple of pieces. So one is the government of Canada is doing a lot through this open roadmap, and they've been really open in terms of if you kind of want to join they've had workshops and dialogues. And similarly at the United Nations, you can look at the United Nations open. I can also, maybe you can send this, I can share this around as well. The United Nations has convened several working groups, and I've been fortunate to be involved in some of those, but there will be more. and they are also producing lots of reports on open science. So that's the I would say both the United Nations and our own government are really kind of big nationally and internationally. But there's also lots of kind of local organizations. So depending on the field that you're interested in, I can also share my email address if if you're looking for something kind of more niche, because there's also lots of pieces that are kind of, as I say, more local, even within UBC.
Can I just ask another side, but it's a very related question to the first one, because we're talking about pharmacists and how they could also contribute to, but maybe how could they also benefit from open science? And this is in particular about drug interactions. And where would you suggest community or hospital pharmacists start looking up drug interactions from open science? You mentioned that drug interaction database. Maybe that's something you could just expand on.
So as I say, I'm not being a pharmacist myself. I'm a data scientist. So I will just share the ones that we've used more from on the research side, but that were recommended to us from other pharmacists, and that was Drug Bank. But then also I will also share. I'll make a note to share the other one that I just saw that was recently published, and they claim to have, I think they said like 250,000 drug interaction DDI pairs, they term them. So I can certainly share some of those. But I would probably not, I can maybe comment from the research perspective, but I couldn't comment from kind of the clinical perspective in terms of what would be clinically.
Okay, I've got another question here. I think you discussed already your thoughts on open science in relation to peer review. Is there anything you wanted to add on that? I think you're very much in favor of open science in the peer review process.
Yeah, I think the peer review piece is really interesting. So because there's kind of different components of that. So there's there's kind of open peer review where the authors and the reviewers are aware of each other, or like that they know their names. But there's also open peer review where the reports are actually published alongside the article, like the BMJ does that, for example. And I think that's a really, really interesting model. Some people say that kind of it definitely increases transparency. Some people have thought that it could potentially increase the quality of peer review when that you're, if you're writing a review. And I've done peer reviews like this where I know it's going to be public. And I can certainly say that, you're probably spending a little bit more time knowing that anyone in the world will see it if the article is published. So I think those are interesting aspects. The only flip side I've seen though, and Colin, maybe this more from, I've seen in Nature, and some of the more basic scientists have said that they think they've sort of said that it creates, their concern is that it creates a more kind of cautious peer review, that people will be overly cautious in their reviews. And so by keeping it kind of the peer review process closed, that people can kind of be more frank and outright in their reviews. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that reflects a culture of often, I think as scientists, we have a culture of not wanting to be critical or criticize. But I actually think criticism is great. I think criticism is great. If someone can point out something that you missed through lots of collaborators like that, that's great. It will improve my science. And like I tell my kids, it's not necessarily just like what you say, it's how you say it as well. So I think that it kind of applies to the peer review process as well. But in general, I think I definitely support and have participated in completely open peer review, and I think it is important.
Yeah, I've done that quite often as well, and I think it does change the way I do it a little bit, but not much. And I really like it. I like to think that someone might be interested in what I thought of the paper from the very beginning, because they often change quite a lot.
Often changes exactly, yeah, and I think it's cool when they also you can openly access the first manuscript, the reviews, the responses, and everything completely open.
Yeah. Are there intellectual property issues that we need to be mindful of in the area of open science? I know you mentioned that in some of your slides.
Yeah, for sure. So disclaimer, that I don't work as much on the IP side, but of course IP is always, a lot of people see it as kind of imposing like full openness versus versus patent protection, patent law, and so on. So I think for sure in some instances we can't really argue against that, but I think in some cases, and some scholars have actually argued that um, in some aspects, patent law is actually a way of achieving open science, because in exchange for this kind of a sort of time limited exclusive right to the commercial I guess exploitation by a developer, in return for a full public disclosure of the invention or the discovery. So some have actually argued that they're not actually in opposition, that the patent law is actually a component of open science. So
Yeah.
I mean, you can kind of, there's probably kind of a middle ground there, but I think that's an interesting point about patent law in respect to open science. But as I say, for sure, absolutely, the patents and sort of just general kind of rights over data, it's definitely an issue that we've encountered, and it's certainly for example, a barrier from industry, for example, to openly share data as well.
Okay, no, that's great. And now, Jacqueline, we're running out of time, so I'm just wanted to end with one more question from the Slido. And so our top question right now is, how can UBC alumni help spread the word and the impact of open science?
Yeah, I think so. I think one is kind of educating yourself on open science through these, as I say, I'll share some of these really great open science resources. I think kind of educating, and then also getting involved in some of these initiatives. A lot of them, I was thinking about, there's with these research clusters that, have some kind of, they have a data science one, but not, and data science is often a component of open data sharing, but a sort of hardcore open science research cluster. And there's lots of other initiatives, as I say, local to get involved in. So I think getting involved, and then also I think trying out, if you're a researcher or a pharmacist, trying out some of the open access data sources in your field, or some of the the clinical for pharmacists, some of the clinical prediction tools or databases, to see just even at first, just to kind of experiment with them and see if they're kind of useful to you, and to talk to other colleagues about these resources.
Okay, and before we close, I'd like to give you a chance to provide a final brief thought to the audience. And in doing so, I'd like to squeeze in one more question from the Slido. It's just, if you had to explain open science to someone, what would be the top 3 points you would focus on?
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. 3 points. So one would for sure be collaboration, as we kind of talked about before. Collaboration, I think collaboration, transparency, and then innovation, I think too, is a really big components. I would say those are the three, and that's probably reflected in some of the United Nations, some of their reports on open science would, I think, kind of highlight some of those principles as well.
Oh, great. And you're going to share some recommended repositories that are good for people to look at, and then maybe you could recommend any specific repositories for publishing open data. That was another question from Slido, but we don't have to address that right here, because it's very, very field specific. So I would just like to give you a big thank you to Dr. Jacqueline Craig for your amazing conversation today, and a big thank you to the audience for joining our conversation today and for your really great questions. I'd like to invite everyone here to please join us at the next Innovative Thinkers webinar in this series, and it is titled Uprooting and Decolonizing Pharmacy. And this is going to be held January 23rd in 2024 at the same time as our program today. And there will be a link put up here for you to go to get more information and to register. So I just want to also say that this webinar series is created to support Forward. It's the UBC, it's the campaign for UBC, which has a bold commitment to solve some of the world's most urgent problems by advancing healthy lives and creating solutions for the planet and shaping thriving societies. And so with that, on behalf of the UBC Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences, this brings our program to a close. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us for this second webinar in the Innovative Thinkers webinar series. I wish everyone well and have a great rest of your day. Thanks.